Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Viktor Pinchuk, and on behalf of the board of Yalta European Strategy, yes, I welcome you to our third yes online conversation. Today, Gillian Tett, one of the world's greatest journalists and editor-in-large of Financial Times USA, will interview Richard Haass, who is president of Council of Foreign Relations, and John Bolton, who is former ambassador of the United States to United Nations and former national security advisor to the President Trump. And recently he became very successful author. And this interview will be about upcoming US presidential election and what they mean for Ukraine. All three speakers spoke repeatedly at our YES events. All three are great friends of YES, and what is really most important, are great friends of Ukraine. It's a great honor to have you all together here. I think everyone in Ukraine watches with extreme attention and interest what happens now in the United States. The United States has given great support to our country, and support is vital for us. What should we expect if President Trump is re-elected, or if his challenger, Joe Biden, wins? With this urgent question, I leave it to our speakers. Gillian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Victor, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are watching, wherever in the world you're watching. We're delighted you have joined us. I am very sad indeed that we're not in Kiev right now. I remember so happily the lovely autumn weather just over a year ago at the last in-person event. Let us hope that we manage to get back in person next year. But in the meantime, I am thrilled and honored to be moderating this online conversation on a topic which is absolutely critical right now. The Brookings Institute put out a report a couple of days ago pointing out that for Americans, I'm quoting, the November the 3rd presidential election will be the most significant vote in many decades, but the election will also have huge consequences for Ukraine. Whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden sits in the White House at the end of the day will matter greatly for US policy towards Ukraine and Europe, I'm quoting. And in many ways, the stakes couldn't be higher because, as you've heard, the US has been very supportive of Ukraine over the last couple of decades. However, that support has been significantly muddied by the stance that President Donald Trump has taken towards Moscow. So the key question is, if Joe Biden ends up winning, will that change radically? If Donald Trump wins, could that change as well, or will he actually double down? We have two incredibly well-placed people to talk about this, both of whom have written excellent books. Richard Haass, the head of the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, has written a book called The World, nice and snappy and easy to remember, and he's been writing for years from his perch at CFR and previously in Washington about foreign policy challenges. And of course, we have Ambassador Bolton, who was previously the last NSC head under Donald Trump, has been ambassador to the United Nations and had a series of roles that have put him in the middle of these incredibly important policy debates. And after stepping down as the 27th National Security Advisor, he then wrote a best-selling book, In the Room When It Happened. So I'd like to start by asking you, both of you, if you were a betting person, if you were giving out probabilities as to who is going to win next week, who do you think is going to be sitting in the White House in January? Richard, I'll start with you, since in some ways you're freest of all to speak right now.
Well, thank you, Gillian. It's good to be here with you, with John, and back doing things with Victor and with Yes. And like you, I look forward to returning to Kyiv and doing these things in person. In the meantime, we'll do it this way. Very hard to make predictions about the American election. So if you are going to bet, I would suggest the bet be modest in scale. Okay. So I would, the one thing that seems almost certain is that Mr. Biden, former Vice President Biden, will receive a majority of the popular vote. But as everyone, or just about everyone, understands, in the United States, we do not elect president by popular vote. We elect it state by state. And there, it's simply impossible to know. It'll come down to a handful of critical states: Florida, Pennsylvania, a few other states scattered around the country. So anyone who sits here with confidence and says the outcome will be X or Y, we don't know. And already we've seen a degree of early voting, a scale of early voting that's quite stunning. You will probably have the largest turnout by maybe 10 million or more votes than we've ever had in this country. And what we also don't know, and John went through this in Florida years ago, this could be very much a contested election. It could be contested in various states. In the last, 24, 48 hours, the Supreme Court has already weighed in. I expect it will be asked to weigh in several other times. So again, I don't normally avoid questions. I'm happy to opine, but I really think the honest intellectual answer is we don't know, because it is going to come down potentially to a relatively small percentage of voters in a handful of states, and that will probably be followed by political and legal challenges. So unless Florida, the state of Florida, clearly comes out for Mr. Biden on election day next Tuesday, then I think we will probably have a scenario which this extends for some time into the future. So I would, I'm happy to go on, but that's essentially my. So I think, one last thing. I think at the moment, Mr. Biden is the quote unquote, I'd say he's a slight favorite, but again, it's so hard to know because we've already had over 60 or 70 million Americans voting. Just today, you had new economic news released. We don't know what the implications of that. And that old saying, a week is a long time in politics. Well, in this case, 4 or 5 days seems like an awfully long time in politics looking forward.
Well, I'd say that actually 4 or 5 hours often feels like a long time in politics right now. And I actually strongly agree with you. I recently read a column saying that financial investors used to draw a distinction between emerging markets and developed markets in how they price political risk, because in emerging markets, you price both for policy change and for process change or process uncertainty. In developed markets, you just price for policy uncertainty. Unfortunately, in America this year, we have both policy uncertainty and process uncertainty, which puts it in quite a different camp. But Ambassador Bolton, I'm curious, if you were a betting man right now, who would you bet on, and with how much confidence?
Well, I would bet $1 on Joe Biden, but I wouldn't bet any more than that. And much of what Richard said, I think, is exactly right. The conversation and even the analysis of the public opinion polling in America today is colored by the debacle of the polling and the commentariat in 2016. Now, they've all got their excuses, but I well remember election night 2016, and there wasn't anybody who didn't think Hillary was going to win, and that includes the Trump campaign, I might add. So there were a lot of very surprised people, a lot of red faces, and a lot of people making excuses. Now, right now, the polling, the conventional polling, shows pretty significant leads for Biden at the national level and in the key states. There are some polls that show narrow Trump wins in some of the key states, and I think election night will reveal somebody's right and somebody's wrong. This is not something where we're going to compromise in the middle. Some of these polls are just irreconcilable with others. But it's not necessarily going to be the case that even in an election, the outcome of which is delayed because of the large number of mail-in ballots that have to be processed, it's not necessarily the case that chaos follows. In the US, all the election conduct of elections is handled at the state and local level. And each state, each county have their own procedures. And they have statutory requirements to contest an election. If you lose 80-20, you can't contest the election. And the ranges are pretty narrow. It's a 0.5% or 1% difference. So in the case of Florida, on election night in 2000, George Bush was certified as the winner. I think it was by 573 votes. You know, it doesn't get much closer than that. And Al Gore filed a contest that lasted for 34, 35 days until the Supreme Court ruled. It's certainly possible we're going to have that, and more than one contest as well. But it doesn't mean that through the web of constitutional and statutory provisions at the national and state level, we don't move inexorably toward a decision. There's no chance that Donald Trump will be holding on to the Resolute desk in the Oval Office by his fingernails if he loses, because the process moves forward without regard to the chaos at the state level if he's able to achieve that. So I'm confident that we'll get through this as we've gotten through other controversial elections, and it may turn out it's not even that close. I underline the word may.
Well, can I just quickly pick you up on that before we turn to the question of policy implications, which is, I'm curious that you are so confident that President Trump will agree to leave if there is a contested result, because I do understand that obviously the Constitution lays out procedures to a certain degree about what should happen. The good news from looking at the data recently is that Americans' trust in the judicial processes and judiciary remains pretty high and at the same level where it was 15 years ago, whereas trust in every other branch of government has collapsed. However, there is a deep concern amongst Democrats that President Trump will not leave and will find ways to simply stay in the White House in spite of that. Are you confident, having worked with the president in the Oval Office and having written a pretty damning book, are you confident that he will actually leave?
Well, he's certainly not going to leave graciously. He's already made that clear. But, you know, it would be nice if somebody provided evidence of how he thinks he's going to stay. The statute, for example, at the federal level provides the Electoral College meets on December the 14th. Now, if states aren't ready to cast their votes, that's their problem. You can't say, oh, well, Florida's not ready yet. We can't have the vote. The vote will take place. And if they don't get to 270, if one candidate doesn't, it will go to the House of Representatives, which the Constitution provides. I don't think that's going to happen. You know, we've gone to the House of Representatives exactly twice in American history. Once was 1801, and the other was 1825. So it's not like they're at the ready to go if in this election. And I think there's a curious convergence here of interest in saying chaos is the inevitable result. I think that is in Trump's interest. I think he'd like nothing better than chaos. That's what he lives in the Oval Office day after day. And I think some of his opponents want to exaggerate the threat that he poses in terms of not being able to leave. So between the two of them, they can raise your blood pressure pretty effectively. But you know, it's a prediction. You can read this back to me someday if I'm wrong. I just don't think that the turmoil is going to be as great as some people fear.
And just before I turn to Richard with that same question, to what degree do you think this chaos story and this chaos narrative is actually the result of deliberate Russian interference in terms of trying to undermine not just the tangible, actual pillars of American democracy, but the perceived credibility of those pillars?
Well, I think it's entirely possible. A lot of it does come from the Russians. I think a lot of it could come from the Chinese, and some measure of it could come from Iran and possibly elsewhere. I think it's understandable why people look at foreign interference and say, well, which candidate do they favor? Are the Russians supporting Trump or the Chinese supporting Biden? What what they really support is disintegrating public confidence in the Constitution and the institutions of American government. So I think all Americans, frankly, I'd wish more people around the world would not do the work of the provocateurs for them. We must be concerned about the integrity of the electoral process. That's absolutely basic, but we have to do it, I think, with clear eyes.
Right. Well, Richard, if Ambassador Bolton's correct, then investors don't need to price for process risk as much, maybe a process delay, but not process risk, just policy risk. Would you agree that you believe that the president will leave the office if he loses and that actually these fears are overblown?
Well, ultimately, you know, the Oval Office is not going to be shared come late January of next year. We're not going to have two desks side by side, and we're not going to have co-presidents. So either Mr. Trump will be serving a second term, or by then it will be President Biden as the 46th president of the United States. I think in part this depends upon the how one-sided or not this election is. I think it's much more likely to be delayed and contested if it's close. And again, that's not a national calculation. It's the calculation in several states of Florida, Pennsylvania, a few others. I think there is a danger about the gap between what looks to be the result on election day on November 3rd, and then what happens in succeeding days in terms of ballots that come in, and you could still have subsequent court decisions about what might be counted. I think the president has done the country no favor in raising questions of fraud and legitimacy, where historically there's precious, thankfully, very little of that. And I think, Gillian, I guess what I would say, what concerns me is not simply this interregnum of 10 weeks or so between election day and inauguration day. And we'll see how that plays out. And there's the potential, obviously, for political battles, legal battles, unfortunately, even some street battles. But it seems to me that you're likely to face a situation that whoever is sitting in the Oval Office come January, he is going to face a situation where a significant percentage of the country, tens of millions of voters, are going to feel that the outcome lacks legitimacy. So we're all used to losing. I've lost more than my share of elections. But I didn't feel when I lost that somehow the other two things, that the process was illegitimate and that the other person didn't have a case, if you will, for being president. What worries me this time is this country is profoundly divided, and it will make governing that much more difficult. Well, I expect we're going to talk about the agenda, whoever's the next president is going to face. It's an awesome agenda. It's a daunting agenda internationally. The domestic context could hardly be more difficult. But adding to that difficulty is we're now a profoundly divided country. In ways that I haven't seen. I'm pushing 70, that I haven't seen in my life. And I think that will make it more difficult for whoever, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I think it's going to make governing that much more difficult.
Absolutely. And just, the figures I referred to earlier, which are very interesting from a Gallup poll, 68% of Americans say they do still trust the judicial branch of government, but only 35% trust the legislative branch and 45% trust the executive branch. And say what's striking is the judiciary trust thus far has remained stable. The other two have collapsed. So let's hope that continues to be the case. But let's game out what will happen depending on the result. Let's start, perhaps counterintuitively, with what will happen if Donald Trump wins again. I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Bolton, if Trump wins again, he won't have to worry about going to voters. He will feel undoubtedly not just completely vindicated, but he will think he has the freedom to double down dramatically. In that context, would you expect to see him essentially taking an even more friendly approach towards Putin, potentially recognizing Russia's control over Crimea, withdrawing from NATO as he threatened to do, and essentially doubling down on every aspect of policy so far? Or do you think instead that there'll be a sudden burst of, one might say, wisdom or a desire to kind of change his legacy in the history books by shifting course? What would you expect to see, Ambassador Bolton, as someone who's worked with him?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand at the beginning is Donald Trump does not have a philosophy. He's not a conservative. He's not a liberal either in American terms. He's Donald Trump. He doesn't think in terms of grand strategy. He doesn't even think in terms of policy as we normally understand that word in Washington or international affairs. He thinks transactionally, ad hoc, erratically, emotionally, instinctively, and he thinks largely in terms of its impact on his own image. Now, in the first term, that was focused on the question of reelection. So in the national security space, time and time again, his decisions were not based on a careful weighing of the pros and cons and the costs and benefits of different policy alternatives given to him, but on what it would look like on the news later that day or the next morning. And in many cases, I found it advantageous to make clearly political arguments to get him to come to the place I thought was most desirable. As you said a moment ago, in a second term, he is freed from this major guardrail. He doesn't need to worry about reelection. He still needs to worry about his own image. He's not completely untethered. But I do think that many people in the US who are supporting Trump on the assumption that you will see in the second term a continuation of much of what he did in the first term is misguided. I think he becomes much more unpredictable, much more uncertain, and frankly, much more dangerous, which is why for the first time in my adult political life, I'm not voting for the Republican nominee for president. And I worry about this because I don't think that there are many constraints that one can see, especially in the foreign affairs field, if he gets a second term. So I do think NATO's in jeopardy. I think the future of the alliance is very much in jeopardy. And I would apply that really around the world, South Korea and Japan as well. I think in the case of Ukraine and the region generally, I'm very worried about the direction that things would go. I think the most unfortunate thing that's happened to Ukraine, conceivable, has been the way Trump has gotten it mixed up in domestic American politics, and really through no fault of Ukraine. And it will be a major task for Ukrainian policymakers in a second Trump term or in a Biden administration just to go back to having a normal relationship with the United States, with the many issues Ukraine has to work out with the United States, just to do it in a normal fashion. I just think finally that there will be far fewer people interested in going into a second Trump term of high quality. And I worry about the impact of that, especially in foreign and defense policy.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Bolton. I must say I can echo the ad hoc nature because I happened to be in the White House a couple of months after President Trump was elected. And with about 30 seconds notice, we got an interview with the president in the Oval Office, literally just shown in ad hoc. I asked him about North Korea, and I think I got an answer which just came out of nowhere. This kind of feeling of literally, improvisation is utterly alien to anything that certainly I've seen before in the White House. But Richard, would you agree that the stakes are that high, that if President Trump does get reelected, we're likely to see an utterly unpredictable, potentially very underpowered in terms of expertise administration that could be taking some very rash decisions, potentially pulling out of NATO or doing all kinds of things?
John and I are not known for a pattern of agreement if one looks back at our respective careers, but we're in pretty violent agreement here today. I'm not sure whose reputation will suffer more for it. We're also both old enough to remember the race between Goldwater and Johnson. And when Barry Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson, this is over 50 years ago. The expression was a choice, not an echo. And we thought that was a wildly consequential election in the United States, that the policy disagreements between these two individuals were profound. In retrospect, they were not that profound. And whatever they were, they pale in significance, I would argue, to the policy differences now. It's a cliche, but every now and then cliches are true, Gillian. This is the most consequential election for the United States, both domestically and internationally. And as a result, it's the most consequential consequential election for the rest of the world, because most of the world does not get to vote in an American election, but all of the world is affected by its results. I think the idea that Donald Trump would normalize, quote unquote, after this election, I see zero reason to believe that. By and large, people of his vintage, and well into his 8th decade, and after an election, if anything, the instinct is vindication, mandate, doubling down, and that once again he defied the experts. So I think there's really zero chance that he becomes a more traditional president. John raised a really good point, which is who would actually serve. I think there's another point. Even if he were to win, and even if the Senate were to go Democratic, under our Constitution, the president still enjoys tremendous discretion and latitude to do what he wants in foreign policy. So I actually think it would be a relatively unrestrained administration. And I see no evidence to think that you would have anything looking like a U-turn. If anything, probably an acceleration, which I think would mean the United States distancing itself from allies. I think it was you or John used the word transactional, or others have used it a lot, but essentially the United States acting relatively unilaterally. United States continuing to keep its distance from multilateral arrangements, be they alliances or institutions or treaties. So I think, again, the foreign policy implications of that would be that whatever still exists of the world that was in many ways developed in the aftermath of the Second World War, a lot of which depends upon the United States for its operation, I think a lot of that would be under severe, severe pressure.
So we're going to turn to talk about Biden in a second, but Richard, I'm just curious, if Donald Trump does win the second term and is short of foreign policy expertise, would somebody like you ever go back into the administration under Donald Trump?
Well, it came up 4 years ago. I had met with the president during the campaign. I'm not quite sure why he asked to meet with me, but he did. And so we spent over an hour together at Trump Tower talking, and it became pretty clear to me that our philosophies of foreign policy did not have a large degree of overlap. I had made the personal decision that I would only go back and work for a president again. I've worked for 4. I've been really fortunate, but I've worked in the Carter administration for Ronald Reagan, and I've worked for both Presidents Bush. And I disagreed with the most recent President Bush profoundly over Iraq and some other issues. And part of my takeaway from that, Gillian, is I would only, if I were ever asked again to serve, I would only do it for an individual with whom I largely agreed. You never expect to always agree. You have to be grown up about it. But I don't think you can serve a president well unless you agree on some of the big things. And it became clear to me after meeting with Mr. Trump when he was still a candidate and observing him that we did not agree on enough of the big things, that either I would be an effective advocate, much less an effective representative of him. So I can't see myself, quite honestly. And it's actually a really sad comment, because I my whole career, I believe passionately in public service. And and you want to have people go in, but I also think John's experience and that of others shows, including his predecessor, if I have my order right, people like H.R. McMaster and others, good people can go in, but good advice is only, and in some ways, is only as valuable as people are prepared to take it.
Right.
So I am skeptical about the value, without even calling myself someone who's good. I'm skeptical that people who say things that this president is not particularly open to or attuned to, I'm wildly unpersuaded they could have much impact.
Right. Well, listen, let's turn to 2 key questions now. One is, what will happen if Biden wins? What should he do? What could he do? And then what impact will this US election have on the inside Ukraine? So let's take the first one about the Biden victory. If we have Biden sitting in the White House in January, how much difference do you think that will make, Richard, in terms of policy? What could he do and what should he do?
Well, look, a President Biden, you have to remember one thing, is that whatever his preferences be in terms of policy, you come into the Oval Office and you inherit a situation. You don't get to choose the world you inherit or the country you inherit. And he would come into a situation where there would be an array of challenges that I would call daunting, and a country that would feel under the weight of COVID-19, widespread unemployment, political divisions, which would be even deeper, racial divisions, and so forth. So my point is simply, it would be a challenging, to say the least, rather, context. That said, Mr. Biden, is very much in the tradition, I would say, of all other American presidents, beginning with Truman, going through Obama. He would believe in the basics of America's alliance relationships. So rather than seeking to disrupt them, I think he would look to strengthen them. I think he would look for various institutions and agreements to re-enter. I think it would become a more consultative presidency. It would be more multilateral. It would be engaged. So I think all of that would be true. I think he would be, though, somewhat restrained by the tremendous domestic pull of the country to focus on those things. But again, to improve alliance relationships, to re-enter certain agreements, it doesn't take a lot of time or effort to do that. I think, though, the reality is, though, that many of the agreements or efforts he would be inclined to re-enter are, I'll be generous, I'll be diplomatic, are imperfect. For various reasons are flawed. So he could go back into the Paris Climate Agreement or into the Iran 2015 nuclear agreement. He could re-enter the World Health Organization, but doing none of those things will solve the problems they were set up to resolve. And so I think that, his all of his instincts and all of his early moves would be in some ways to reestablish elements that you might call familiar or traditional American post-World War II internationalism. And as the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, it won't shock you to say that I'm sympathetic to that sort of thing. I've been called all sorts of names as a result. But I think it's all necessary. I would simply say it's not sufficient.
Well, Ambassador Bolton, you've taken a very different policy stance in the past from Richard. In your view, what should a President Biden do? What could he do? And what do you think he actually will do? And I should say, by the way, this partly depends, obviously, on who would be as Secretary of State. So let's presume that would probably be somebody like Chris Coons. But what do you think President Biden could, should, or will do?
Well, this is a depressing subject for me because it will demonstrate how depressed I'm going to be on election night, regardless of who wins. I'm thinking I'm just going to go to bed early and hope that I don't have to go through it. But look, in American terms, Biden's default position is that he's a fairly conventional center-left Democrat. He's been involved in foreign affairs significantly for a long time. And I think much of what he would like to do is predictable. And I think really a major part of his task, and he won't like this comparison, is he will be the Warren Harding of 2020. 100 years ago exactly, Warren Harding ran for the presidency under the slogan of a return to normalcy. And in many respects, Biden, certainly in the international sphere, would represent a return to the Democratic Party's view of normalcy. I think the damage that Trump has done, and I may disagree with Richard on some of the specifics of what that damage was, but on the conduct of foreign affairs generally, I think Trump has done a lot of damage to the reputation of the United States as a friend and ally, having anything like a consistent policy, whether you agree or disagree with it. I think that damage can be repaired quickly, even by a Democrat who has different policy views. So I think that's very important. But the big unknown for Biden I think comes in two pieces. Number one, it's a paradigm of American political life that when the people who were in a former administration, in this case the Obama administration, are out of office for a period of years, and then they come back into office, there's a tendency to sort of ignore the 4 years in between. I saw that on the Republican side when those of us who were in the Bush 41 administration, 8 years of Clinton, came back into Bush 43. For a lot of people, as if we just left a few days before and we were now back and we were going to resume what we were doing then. That isn't going to happen that way. And I think because we have not had much discussion on foreign policy in this campaign, people have not gotten a good sense of how Biden and his team, whoever that is, will adapt to it. And number two, and I think this is an even bigger unknown, Biden represents a very divided party at this point. Now, I have to give the devil its due. The left wing of the Democratic Party has gritted its teeth, sucked its gut in, and is going to vote for Biden and is working hard for them. But as Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez of New York, one of the pillars of the left wing of the Democratic Party, said a few days ago, the real battle begins on November the 4th, that is to say, the day after the election, within the party to decide what their policies are going to be. Now, she has focused almost exclusively on domestic policy. We don't really know in much detail how the left and the Democratic Party views many of these critical foreign policy issues. But I would expect that this internal battle will be reflected in personnel decisions. You mentioned Secretary of State. I would have said Susan Rice was the leading candidate, but each will have his own prediction. And they will fight who will be the Secretary of the Treasury. Will it be Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, which would have a profound impact on international policy? So although I think we can say with some confidence what we think the Joe Biden alone would look like in the context of a very complex election victory on his side, it really makes it uncertain, especially in areas where there's been really very little consideration, like Ukraine dealing with Russia, European issues. There's going to be a lot of struggle within the administration before we get clear insights, would be my guess.
Yeah, I mean, you make a very good point there, because, of course, the lack of the proper discussion around foreign policy in the whole last few weeks, be that in the presidential debates or anything else, is quite astonishing, and is one reason, of course, why so many of the allies around the world are so concerned about this. But Richard, I'm curious, I mean, have you had discussions inside the Council of Foreign Relations about what a Biden presidency could and should do or will do, say, in relation to Ukraine? I mean, would you expect, you say, you know, we expect to see a return to normalcy. Does that mean, for example, that the US administration will take a very tough position on Crimea, double down on NATO? Would that be what you'd expect under Biden?
Again, I'm always a little bit reluctant to make hard predictions, but I would think you'd have a much closer relationship between the United States and its NATO partners. It was known that then Vice President Biden favored the provision of lethal assistance to Ukraine. He has been robust on that issue. I would think you'd have a tougher policy towards Mr. Putin in Russia over everything from election interference to Ukraine. I think, though, there would be a willingness to figure out a way to still sit down with Russia to try to extend the New START agreement if something hadn't been done already before then. So in that sense, I see no movement towards accepting what Russia has done in Crimea. I think I see no chance of that. I think there would be interest in whether one could reactivate, if that's the right word, Minsk, basically to try to move towards some type of outcome that would end what's going on in eastern Ukraine in an acceptable manner. So in that sense, I think you would have if you want to call that normalcy, what I think you would no longer, I guess I'd say two things. I don't think in Ukraine you would have the concern of anything being done between the United States and Russia that would be done at Ukraine's expense. I think people in Ukraine could relax. And it gets me to something you asked John before. I just wanted to raise it. I think the goal for Ukraine, let me make a bizarre analogy. It ought to be something like India. The goal ought to be that Ukraine has a good relationship with the United States, regardless of whether you have Democrats or Republicans in control in the White House or Congress. This is a relationship we want to prepare for the long haul. This is an important relationship for both sides. So I want to take the politics out of it. I want to make it a good old-fashioned foreign policy relationship where we have overlapping interests. Each side has its concerns. The United States will continue to press Ukraine about issues like corruption and the rule of law and so forth. But it ought to be a good old-fashioned traditional foreign policy-based relationship. And I think you'd see elements of that, or more elements of that, hopefully, if our politics were to change.
Well, I want to ask you about that in a moment, particularly in relation to some of the scandals and the way that that has poisoned domestic politics, or rather, the relations between the US and Ukraine have been poisoned by domestic politics that way around. But before I do that, do you think that a Biden administration would support Ukraine drawing closer to the European Union? Richard or John or Ambassador Bolton?
Well, again, if it's the EU, it's not our call to make. I think there'd be more comfort with that than there would be with NATO in the foreseeable future. But I think right now the EU has its hands full. So I'm learning to be a diplomat.
Right.
So at the moment, I don't see either of those issues, either NATO or EU, those relationships changing. What I think the emphasis will be on is promoting economic progress in Ukraine. There's obviously COVID, which exacerbates the challenges, the legal corruption issue, dealing with that, and obviously trying to deal with the ongoing problem in the East because of Russia. I think those would be the focus rather than transformational type things like NATO or the EU. I don't see that on the immediate agenda.
Ambassador Bolton, would you agree with that?
Well, I think from Ukraine's perspective, I hope nobody thinks the EU is their salvation because they're going to wait a long time for it. I think what's interesting, and I can't really predict this with much certainty, but whereas a couple of years ago we would have said, looking at Russia and the former Soviet Union, that while there were many problems, Ukraine was singularly difficult because of the annexation by Russia of the Crimea, because of their involvement militarily in the Donbass. And yet, as we sit here today, you've got increased instability in Central Asia, governments being overthrown. The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh is at its highest level, I think, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And while I don't think Russia's role has been really as unhelpful as Turkey's, it's obviously much on their mind. The problem with Georgia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia hasn't gotten any easier. Moldova is still there. You've got turmoil in Belarus, and every indication that Putin will take advantage of this to buttress Lukashenko and increase Russian involvement there. They're still trying to poison people with Novichok. Really, it's the chutzpah of the year award that after they go after the Skripals with Novichok, then they use it on Navalny too. You'd think they'd find some other chemical to try and assassinate their political enemies to leave fewer clues. But you do have uncertainty and turmoil and dissent within Russia itself. So the former Soviet Union as a whole, as a space, I think is in much more turmoil, and that I would say gives the West some opportunities if Biden is willing to take a more forward position, and I think this is the bigger if, the Europeans are willing to do anything. I'm not sure, and by that I mean Germany specifically. And in Germany now you've got a leadership crisis, the answer to which I don't see. So I think there's a lot at play here, and I think this is an argument for a much more involved American role. But whether Biden will have the bandwidth to do it with everything else he's got on his plate, and whether there will be much European interest in this, I don't know. But there are developments underway that are really beyond our control. This conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, or over Nagorno-Karabakh, has been pretty violent, with some pretty advanced weaponry, and ceasefires have broken down. So if you were looking at trouble spots around the world, if somebody said what isn't keeping you up at night but should have, I would say the periphery of the former Soviet Union.
Well, as someone who did a PhD in the periphery of the former Soviet Union, I could not agree more. But sorry, Richard, I cut you off.
No, I apologize for it. I just wanted to piggyback on that. And I think it raises, John used the word I use a lot, which is bandwidth, because I think Ukraine is not playing out its history in a vacuum. One, as I mentioned before, the domestic challenges of the next American president, and if it's President Biden, he'll obviously have to attend to it. Second of all, internationally, I think China is going to be a major challenge, obviously, for whomever is sitting in the Oval Office. And I think, for example, the possibility of, say, a crisis over Taiwan can't be dismissed. So we can imagine that the focus of the United States is forced international, and it could be over something like that. I think friction is going to be the operative word, to say the least, between the United States and China, regardless of what happens next week. And then obviously a Biden administration also will be much more concerned about global issues, including things like climate change. So Ukraine will be a consideration, and but I think it's going to play out in this larger context of tremendous pressure to turn inward. And again, these other international challenges, almost like what John said, could be beyond our control. Xi Jinping is a very different kind of leader of China, given what he's doing domestically and what he seems to be prepared to do outside. So that could very much, Macmillan's comment about events, dear boy, events could drive the United States into focusing in ways that we can't yet anticipate.
Well, that's a very good point. And of course, attention deficit disorder is a perennial problem of Washington politicians. And we could end up with a situation where Ukrainian suffers by being ignored. But what do you think, speaking as you are from Washington and New York State, what do you think this is going to mean for the domestic situation for Ukraine? Would either of you dare to hazard a view on what it means domestically for Ukraine?
Well, I'll take a shot at it first. I think that when President Zelensky was elected, it was clear to us sitting as observers in Washington that that the citizens there put a very high priority on eliminating corruption, and that the issues of domestic reform, revitalizing the economy, were very, very high priorities. And so in a way, although I think Richard and I agree, we would like to see Ukraine become a more normal foreign policy issue. I'm not sure the bandwidth in Kiev is as great, perhaps, as it needs to be. And these domestic issues, I think, are very complicated for Ukraine, and I don't have any particularly good ideas for them from the outside. I think what the role of the U.S. should be is to push back on the Russians, to provide space for Ukraine to work out its own domestic problems. But that's not easy. It has been a problem for many of the states of the former Soviet Union to establish working governments that are not subject to all this pulling and tugging. And the best that can be said is that it's going to take some time. So if we had space where if we had enough time, then I'd be more confident. But if this turmoil in Russia and really pressure on Putin to do things externally to buttress his domestic position weren't so great, I might be more confident. But I really am worried that Ukraine itself doesn't have the ability to move as fast as maybe it needs to, despite internal reforms that have been made. That much more needs to be done.
Richard.
Look, the internal reforms in Ukraine have two advantages. One is they'd be good for Ukraine, and two, I would love for the fact when a senior American and senior Ukraine officials get together, that part of the agenda is much reduced because there's not as much to talk about. And then we can focus on things like Russia and what to do about that. So I think for many reasons that it's in Ukraine's interest. And then that's really up to President Zelensky and those around him. In that sense, that'll be far more important than anything the United States says or does.
Right. Well,
just by definition.
Okay, well, I'd like to turn to one other point that Ambassador Bolton mentioned earlier, which is the fact that domestic political fights have muddied the relationship between the US and Ukraine, and in particular, the scandal controversy over President Trump's interference, or rather involvement, in pushing for answers around Joe Biden's son's involvement in Ukrainian company. I'm curious now, with the benefit of hindsight, Ambassador Bolton, what do you make of that whole saga? And do you think that the boil can be lanced in terms of the poison that created of domestic policies, of domestic controversies, mudding US-Ukrainian relationship going forward?
Well, I think there will be an aftermath. I don't think there's any question. But if Trump loses and Biden comes in, I think the odds are that it will disappear fairly quickly. Now, that's not to say it won't be the subject of political discourse, but one of the issues I think going forward, and I'll just speak as a Republican here, is that one of the distortions of the Trump era is that we stopped talking about policy differences and started talking about whether you agree with Donald Trump or not. So if Donald Trump says Hunter Biden's conduct in Ukraine is a major issue, Trump's followers all said, absolutely, we got to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't care less what Hunter Biden did in Ukraine. He may have embarrassed his father. He may have done a lot of things that showed poor judgment. There's no evidence of corruption. And anyway, it's not that big an issue. People can investigate it. They can look at it. But honestly, Trump's removal from office will make a lot of things easier, particularly with respect to Ukraine. I'm not saying it will disappear overnight, but I hope and believe it will disappear quickly, which would facilitate what I think we're talking about, which is getting, it's another aspect of return to normalcy. We have a lot of really substantive issues to discuss with Ukraine, and that's what we ought to discuss.
Right. Richard, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I agree. I say, look, it's going to continue on places like Fox News, but that's to be expected. I think that's also where the question of who controls the Senate could be important. If the Republicans still control committees, then they could hold certain types of hearings. They could keep an issue alive. If Democrats control the Senate, then that goes away. So, and again, I think that would be healthy for about 86 different reasons.
Well, thank you. And I think that seems like a very good note on which to end, because I think the one thing that's become crystal clear from this conversation is that there is a huge amount of uncertainty looking to the future, not just around the election result. And I think, in my view, you have both rightly stressed that in spite of the poll showings, there is a lot of uncertainty. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the degree to which a new Biden administration, if it does come in, will be able to both have the resources to focus on the Ukraine, but also actually have the resources or luxury of time and attention and essentially a peaceful Russia to actually try and push forward some kind of better resolution. But what is clear, that we've all agreed very strongly that a more normal, a more healthy relationship and foreign policy climate would be in everyone's interest right now. So it just remains for me to say a big thank you to both of you for sharing your thoughts, which are incredibly illuminating at any time, but particularly now, given that we are on the eve of this very, very consequential election. I don't quite believe you, Ambassador Bolton, that you're going to go to bed early that night, but if you do, in fact, that may not be such a bad thing, because the cliffhanger may come 3 or 4 days later. So we'll all need lots of sleep by then. But for all of you who want distraction in the days after the elections, the Yes Foundation is going to be holding online another discussion between Fareed Zakaria and Egil Lievitz, who is a Latvian president, on November the 10th. So do please tune in. If any of you want to watch this event, it's going to be posted on YouTube. Do also talk about it on social media if you feel the need to. And it just remains me to say, last of all, a very big thank you to all of you watching. A big thank you to our two fantastic speakers for taking part in this discussion. And I hope you all, wherever you are in the world, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.